Hey guys, my name is Jordan and you're watching The Right Book. So today I thought I would talk about my favorite horror and slash thriller books. I love horror and I love thriller and I just love reading horror and thriller. So let's get into it. I'm gonna start with a few classics and they're all by different authors, but they're all amazing. So first of all, I have The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. So this, like we all know, follows the possession and exorcism of a girl who's possessed probably by Satan. So that's fun. The book is so much worse than the movie. Like, and what by worse I mean like so much more graphic. Like, it can get very polarizing. Let's say polarizing for lack of a better word. But either way, really spooky. The writing is fairly good. I don't remember it being overly beautiful or flowery or anything, but it was well written. I would recommend this for a Halloween read. Another classic, of course, is The Shining by Stephen King. It is quite different from the movie, and it also has a few scarier type of scenes, but also at the same time not quite scary. I think there was only one scene in the book that got me a little spooked out. Other than that, it was just like a good psychological kind of thriller kind of book. But either way, I really enjoy it, and I would recommend it if you like Stephen King, if you like The Shining, and if you like just good books in general. I would recommend it. One of my favorite suspense and horror authors is Shirley Jackson, but she wrote horror slash psychological type of fiction, as well as actually books about parenting, which I think is really interesting. You've probably heard of The Haunting of Hill House, and you've probably heard of We've Always Lived in the Castle. The Haunting of Hill House, of course, is a ghost story, and then We Have Always Lived in the Castle is this tiny book about this strange family, or rather these two sisters who live in this house out on the border of another town, and the townspeople don't like the sisters. They may have murdered their families. I would check out Shirley Jackson because she's amazing. The way she writes and the atmosphere that she creates with her characters is awe-inspiring. She's absolutely phenomenal at what she did. So the next book that I have is The Dumb House by John Burnside. I believe it was actually his debut novel. The Dumb House by John Burnside is about a man who as a child hears this story from his mother about a prince who wanted to prove that language was inherent and that people just knew how to speak. And so he placed a bunch of newborn children inside of what he called a dumb house, and only had mute and deaf nurses care for them to prove that they would just learn how to speak by themselves. And as this man is growing up, he becomes fascinated with the idea of that speaking is inherent and what the soul is made out of, and he wants to see the soul. He wants to try to touch it, try to hold it in his hands. And it's basically about him and his descent into being a psychopath. It's such a good book. It's one of those books where you read it and you're kind of like going along with everything. Even though everything is so horrific and terrible, you're still reading it and almost like agreeing. I would recommend this like just to everyone. Everyone should read this. So the next book is a Gillian Flynn book, and that is Sharp Objects. This is probably my favorite of her novels. It is fairly short. It's I think like over 245 pages, and it's one of those books that like you read really quickly because it's so fast-paced and you want to know what is going to happen. Fresh from a brief stay at a psych hospital, Camille Preaker's first assignment on her second-rate daily paper takes her reluctantly back to her hometown to cover murders of two preteen girls. As she works to uncover the truth, Camille finds herself identifying with the young victims a bit too strongly. Dogged by her own demons, Camille will have to confront what happened to her years before if she wants to survive this homecoming. So it's like a psychological thriller slash mystery novel about these gruesome murders of these children And this woman basically going back to confront her own childhood and what happened and the trauma that she's survived. If you really like mystery, if you really like psychological stuff, this is for you. If you haven't read it already, it's absolutely wonderful. The next book is I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Leanne Reed. I read it in one sitting. This is one of those books where you start it and you're like, yeah, this is good. And then all of a sudden you're like 3/4 of the way through and you can't sleep because you need to finish it. I love this book. It's basically about a woman who goes on a road trip with her boyfriend to visit his parents for the first time, but she's thinking about ending things. It sounds like a really basic, simple premise, but then it just escalates and escalates. I would recommend this a lot, especially if you like creepy books. So these 3 next books are kind of like in the middle of things. So I have You by Carolyn Kepnes, My Best Friend's Exorcism, and Hex by Thomas Old Hulfelt. So Hex, let's start with, is a horror novel about a town that's being haunted by a witch. And she's a 17th century woman whose eyes and mouth have been sewn shut. So she's this like old, decrepit witch with her eyes sewn and her mouth sewn, and she just walks around and like shows up in people's houses. It was so different from anything that I had read or seen before, and I really appreciated that. The only thing was the ending for me was a little bit strange. I know that this is translated, I think from the Swedish, translated by Nancy Forrest Filer. The original version has a different ending than this ending. Really wish I could read the ending of the first original one, because the ending for this one for me was a little bit rushed and a little bit like weird. It didn't seem to like make sense for the entire progression of the novel. But either way, I really enjoyed it. It had like major creep factor. The next one is kind of like a little bit funny, and that is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. He also wrote Horror Store, which I don't have, but I do want to read eventually. This follows 2 best friends in, I believe, 1988, in the 1980s, and they go out and they're partying with their friends and stuff, and her best friend, our main character's best friend, goes missing for a little bit, and then she comes back, but she's acting weird, and eventually she finds out that her best friend is possessed by a demon. If you like that kind of like funny, fluff, sort of easy reading, kind of like scary stuff, then like I think you would really like this, because Grady Hendrix writes it really well, where it doesn't take itself too seriously. Although there was one scene in this book that like literally kind of had me a little afraid. I really enjoyed it. And then the next one, which I would classify it more as like a thriller / psychological thriller, and that is You by Carolyn Kepnes. This is, I'm sure you've already heard of it, but this is a book basically told from the point of view of a woman's stalker. The back says, "You're going to be so sorry when you realize what you made me do. The good news is that I have no regrets." The book is told from the point of view of Joe, but it's almost like he's like writing to Beck, who is the woman that he's like stalking and manipulating into loving him. It's so weird because you're kind of rooting for him. It's kind of similar to The Dumb House, where you're reading these things that are terrible and like not at all normal or healthy, but you're kind of like rooting for him. Incredibly well written. The characters are completely fleshed out, in my opinion. I really was convinced of Joe as a character overall. I really enjoyed this one. The next 2 books are probably my favorite horror novels of all time. Let's start with let's start with It by Stephen King. So It, in case you didn't know or haven't seen the recent movie, or remake, sorry, is a novel about children who defeat this monster who can basically morph into whatever they're afraid of, and then 27 years later they go back and go to defeat it again because it's returned. But of course this is like a giant book, and I read it about a month ago. It is a behemoth of a book, and not only that, but it is terrifying. I watched the remake, the movie, and like the movie compared to like all of the shit that goes on in here is like, is tame. It's tame. Like there's so much detail and so much more gruesome, just disgusting death scenes, and like it's amazing. And I love the way that Stephen King writes. Even though this book could be like at least 300 pages shorter, I still appreciate how much detail and how much work he puts into his novels and his storytelling, because you can tell that he's honestly like passionate about his work and his stories, and I really appreciate that about him. And this book is no exception. So if you like it, if you like the movie, if you're interested in it, I would recommend reading the book as well, because the book is absolutely amazing and it's terrifying as well. So my favorite horror novel of all time so far is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. So this book, isn't that cool? This book is also a behemoth. This is one of the weirder books that I own, in the sense that, in the way that it's formatted. So it's kind of a story within a story within a story. So this book is told kind of through layers. So there's Zambino, who is, or Zambano, whatever his name is. There's this old guy who wrote this manuscript analyzing this documentary called The Navidson Project, which is basically about this guy named Navidson, who's this kind of like blacklisted journalist slash photographer. Navidson made this documentary about him and his family moving into this new house, and they realize that their house is larger on the inside than it is on the outside. So they find that corridors appear out of nowhere in their house, or like little closets will appear, and basically it's almost like a labyrinth is within his house, where there's space where there shouldn't be space. So Zampino writes this manuscript analyzing this documentary, and then Johnny Truant, this like teenage, like early 20s druggie slash tattoo parlor employee, finds it after Zampino dies and reads it, and then also adds his own footnotes to the manuscript. Basically, it's like telling the story of Navidson and his family in the documentary, which apparently like doesn't exist, or like Johnny Truant can't find any proof that this documentary exists, and then Johnny Truant's also maddening descent into craziness. But what's really interesting about this book is how it's written. So you have pages like this where there's like nothing on them, but then you also have pages like this where things are just, the text is everywhere, and like, so sometimes it's like full pages, and then other times like empty, or like this. So when I was reading it, I found that the formatting was similar to how the story was being told. If the character were feeling claustrophobic, I would find that like the text would be getting smaller and smaller and smaller as each page passed. And it's really effective, the formatting and the way he did this book, because it kind of adds this like whimsical confusion to everything, which is kind of how the book is, you know? I love this book so much, and it honestly is terrifying. I wouldn't read it if you are really easily scared, or you don't want to be scared that easily, because this book gets under your skin and then it like lives there forever. So that was my favorite spooky and scary reads. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know down below if you have any scary book recommendations, because like I'm always looking for new horror books, and I just want to be scared all of the time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!